Well, thank you, Ben, for the introduction, and first and foremost, thank you to TeamBEST and Bath University Debate Society for organising this debate here this evening. On a topic which I'm sure most of you will be sick and tired of by the end of 2017, but a debate that is hugely important, because the last time the British people were consulted on this issue, as many of you will know, was some 40 years ago. But things were very different back then, and the community of nations to which we joined hands back in the 1960s, we find is very different to the sinking ship on which we are passengers today. On the face of it, the European project was set up with the very best of intentions. In the 1940s, few would argue that something needed to be done to prevent Europe from suffering the devastation of world wars as it had done previously. And with this, we had the economic community, the European economic community, the idea of which being that by trading together, by cooperating together, we could stop Europe from enduring future wars. Unfortunately, though, this was never really the true agenda of the architects of the European project, and it most certainly is not the agenda of its masters today. Far from being a project of peace, the European Union is now a project about power. In fact, in a Europe that was once divided from east to west by the Berlin Wall, we now increasingly find that we live in a Europe that's divided from north to south by the catastrophe that has been the Eurozone. And perhaps most worryingly, the very nationalisms, thanks to the continued failings of the European Union, the very nationalisms and extremisms we're seeing a rebirth. The very nationalisms and extremisms that the European Union initially set out to destroy. And perhaps no more is this the case than in those countries that today find themselves captives in the economic and democratic prison of the Eurozone. For a second, I want you to imagine you're not being asked should Britain leave the European Union. I'd like you to imagine that Britain's being asked should we join the European Union. Imagine you're being asked to join an organisation that would charge a membership fee of £55 million a day, an organisation whose parliament and their court would have supremacy over that of ours, an organisation, membership of which would mean that the majority of our laws are made somewhere else, an organisation who concentrates the sole right to propose legislation in the hands of 27 unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats, an organisation that would give us a complete open border to 500 million people across the continent, and an organisation that would ban us from making our own trade deals with the rest of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, I know what the outcome of that referendum would be, as I'm sure do most of you. Now, what you will hear tonight from those against the motion is that Britain simply isn't good enough, that Britain couldn't possibly tread water in the open seas of the international stage. Ladies and gentlemen, Britain is the world's 5th largest economy. We are one of 8 industrialised nations. We are the world's 4th largest military power. We're a permanent seat holder on the UN Security Council. We're one half of the special relationship. We have unparalleled links throughout the Commonwealth. Our language is the most widely spoken, our monarch the most universally adored. Ladies and gentlemen, Britain has been a leader on the international stage for centuries, and that will continue when we become an independent, self-governing nation once again. And it's for this reason that I believe that we should reconfigure our relationship with the European Union. Let's have one that's based on friendship, on cooperation, on trade, one that very much similar to that most of your ancestors would have voted yes to back in 1975. But let's be free to govern ourselves, let's be free to control our own borders, and let's be free to make our own trade deals with the rest of the world. Those against this proposition will argue that no, Britain must stay the course of this project, that we must embark on the doomed mission of reforming an institution, an organisation which frankly is beyond reform. They will insist that we should continue to tip buckets out of water outside of the sinking ship, somehow hoping that it will stay afloat. Ladies and gentlemen, I say that our lifeboat is here in the form of this referendum. I say we take it and captain our own voyage as an independent, self-governing, global trading nation. And tonight, I hope that some of you will agree. Thank you.
Thank you, Louis, for that fine speech, and I would now like to invite the opposition to continue the debate.
All right. Sorry, I thought someone else was speaking before me. Just give me a second to get my camera up. So thank you, Joe, for inviting me to speak, and thank you, Louis, for that heartfelt speech with which I wholeheartedly disagree. So quick introduction of myself. I'm not British, yes. I am actually an EU migrant. I'm half Italian, half Irish, and I moved here 4 years ago to take advantage of your great education system and come to this great university. So what I'd like to do tonight is I'd like to say exactly the opposite of Louis, why I believe that the UK should stay in the EU. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this so it will be easier for me 5 years down the line to get a student visa or to get a work visa, sure, but really the main reason is because I believe that the UK's position is best positioned to be in the EU, and also the EU itself benefits with the UK being in it. So I'll take basically more or less three main arguments that Louis and general Eurosceptics use to say why we should leave. The first one, we don't have sovereignty. As you heard, Louis said most of our laws are made outside the UK and actually are made in Brussels. Now that's actually false. In fact, the statistic that Farage uses to claim this is from the House of Commons paper from 2010. And this actually says that the discussion about what percentage of laws are made outside of the UK is misleading because, quote, it remains virtually impossible to give an accurate answer to the question about the number of national measures based on EU requirements. Because, in fact, the UK has become so well integrated within the EU and its interests are so aligned with the EU that such a discussion is meaningless. And in fact, as the UK is not a member of the Euro and so arguably not of this sinking ship, the only area where the EU, other than obviously trade, has an exclusive competence is the area of the conservation of marine biological resources. So unless you are particularly concerned with your sovereignty over such policies, then I would argue that leaving the EU is not the solution for you. Moving on to my favorite argument, we don't have control of our borders. Yeah, you don't. In the EU, at least for within EU migration, you don't. But is that really a problem? Are us EU migrants really a problem? I'd like to take some of the main misconceptions and try to point out their main fallacies in them. First main conception, us EU migrants are lazy and we don't work. False. 80% of EU migrants in the UK are employed, which is actually higher than the national average of 74%. And the argument goes, well, that's actually the problem. You take our jobs. Well, actually, that's not true. There's a multitude of studies which actually say that this is false. And in fact, a recent study published by the LSE this year actually said that not only EU migration in the past 10 years has not increased UK national employment, but this is because basically new jobs made in the UK, most of them are not accounted by EU migrants, it's actually UK citizens. So then the argument goes, okay, maybe you're not taking our jobs. But actually, what you are taking is taking more money from our state than what you're given. Again, that is false. In fact, the UCL study published last year in 2014 revealed that between 2000 and 2011, us EU migrants had provided an overall net positive benefit contribution to the British state of approximately 20 billion. And in case you're wondering, also our Polish, Bulgarian, and Romanian friends have also had a positive net contribution of 5 billion. So it would be a shame if you argued to leave the EU just to restrict EU migration, because we are not taking your jobs, we're not depressing your wages, and if anything, we're just adding to the multicultural diversity of this country. And as well, we're also having a positive contribution to your state finances, so why would you leave based on that? But if you don't buy my argument, just consider the following. Under the Treaty of Lisbon, when you vote to go out, before you go out, you will have to sign a free trade agreement. And it is highly unlikely that you are able to sign a free trade agreement without actually even agreeing to the free movement of people. And the final argument, there's no value for money in the EU. Now, I'm not going to go into the normative debate about this. I'll just highlight a figure. The UK's net contribution to the EU in 2014 was about £10 billion. And it is said to be about this figure for the next 10 years. You might think it's a lot of money. Yeah, maybe. It's about 0.5% of your country's GDP. But let's look what you get from that money. You get an access to a market of about 500 million people. In fact, it is no coincidence that the UK's largest trading partner is the EU, because, ironically, it's because you are, in fact, inside the EU. And also, by being inside the EU, the UK partakes in free trade agreements that the EU itself as an institution has made with 50 other states. So effectively, the argument that we should leave the EU to then remake again those 50 free trade agreements doesn't make much sense because you already have them here. So to conclude, I'm definitely not saying that there are no problems in the EU. I mean, being from Italy, I've seen them myself. But what I'd say is that the solution, even if you take the far left in Southern Europe, they all see that the solution is within, and especially in the case of the UK, it lies within. Because even if you leave, your problems of migration, your problems of implementing EU laws, and your problems of paying money will stay the same. So to my British friends in the House, beyond tonight, when it actually comes to voting, please vote to stay. Because you need the EU to achieve your global aspirations as a country, and the EU needs you to become a stronger body that can effectively deal with the challenges of the 21st century.
Bruce to conclude the case for the proposition.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much for your excellent speeches. Having seen the vote earlier on, I'm feeling a bit like a turkey trying to argue for Christmas in this room. However, I'm going to give a few thoughts about the economy, and in particular, there are two aspects of the economy I'd like to talk about. One of them is the performance of the Eurozone economy and how that affects the UK, and the second one is how British membership of the EU can affect some aspects of the UK economy, which are particular to the UK economy, in particular financial services. But first of all, looking at the performance of the Eurozone economy over the last 20, 30 years, I think even the most ardent supporter will admit it's been pretty tepid at best. Over the last 10 years, for instance, they've not managed to get an average annual real GDP growth of above 1%, which is pretty poor, really. UK's admittedly isn't much better, but nonetheless, it has managed slightly more than 1%, about 1.5%. Now, this has an effect on the UK. The UK is very much dependent, in some respects, on trade with the Eurozone. But because of the lack of growth, there isn't a great deal of demand for UK exports at the moment. This is, but the UK has continued to take EU imports. This has led to a very large trade balance with the rest of the EU. You may wonder, and well into the tens of billions, you may wonder, does this actually matter? Well, trade balances and particularly running very large deficits or large surpluses can have an effect on the stability of the economy. For instance, some have argued that the financial crisis was in fact due to some countries running very high surpluses, leading to massive amounts of liquidity in the world economy looking for a return, and they ended up getting a return but with extremely high risk bonds, which led to the financial crisis. So having large deficits and surpluses can have an effect on the world economy. The other aspect of the Eurozone economy over the last few years in particular has been the financial crisis, or the Eurozone crisis as it's known, and the fact is that the last, as I say, 4 or 5 years, we've had 6 months stability followed by 6 months of crisis. And in general, the stability has been bought by market intervention, which is printing of money and buying up government bonds in order to support the bond market. Without that support, I suspect the bond markets would be in serious trouble in some countries, and we would have seen quite possibly a collapse of the Eurozone. The problem is that you can only intervene short term. This is a short-term policy which won't last for more than, certainly in the long run. In the long run, there has to be a fiscal union in the EU. The problem is because the EU doesn't want a fiscal union. It doesn't want to make the fundamental long-term changes that the European economy requires. Not so long ago, Alan Greenspan, you probably remember him, was the former head of the Federal Reserve. He's not particularly popular because he's blamed of the financial crisis. But he said that the European Union economy, the Eurozone economy would not stabilise, would not be able to grow, and would not have a stable government bond markets until there was a fiscal and political union. And as I say, this doesn't seem to be happening, in which case at some point the Eurozone economy is going to suffer a very big crisis. I think as bad as the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. You cannot keep intervening month in, month out, spending tens of billions of euros supporting any market, including the government bond market. At the moment, it's called quantitative easing. Quantitative easing involves buying up government bonds and corporate bonds. It's really an excuse to support the bond market and nothing more. The other point I want to make was that the UK is very much dependent on financial services. In particular, it's heavily dependent on the city. Something like 10% of GDP in the UK comes from financial services, mostly from the city. The city has been a huge success for the UK in the last few hundred years because, for a number of reasons, one of which has been that it is not overly regulated compared with its competitors in New York and in Hong Kong. The problem is that the EU, in terms of its financial services governance, wants to control the whole of the EU, not just the Eurozone, but the whole of the EU financial services, and has stipulated that the UK must have extra regulations which will make it uncompetitive in the world economy. The city is actually shrinking, has shrunk since the financial crisis, whereas other competitors in New York and Hong Kong have continued to expand. So that's it, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. And I would now like to invite Horst to conclude the case for the opposition.
Yeah, thank you. I'm another migrant. I'm from Germany. Anyway, I would argue that Britain should stay in the UK. Sorry, in the EU. Mainly because the alternative is worse. And what the Eurosceptics do not realize is this problem. You know? They are committing what we are calling the nirvana fallacy, so comparing the reality with an unattainable situation that is an ideal, but is unfortunately unattainable. For example, I'm just commenting on the speeches that have been made in favor of leaving. Financial services industry, right. That's a good point to start actually. Because what would happen if the UK would leave the European Union is that a large chunk of the financial services industry actually would relocate to the rest of the European Union, or to the core of the European Union, for example to Frankfurt. And banks like Goldman Sachs or Deutsche Bank have already said so. The Swiss banks actually are here, they have a huge presence in the city of London, because they do not have full access from Switzerland to the internal market, to the single market. They will also leave, of course, the city if the UK would decide to leave the European Union. So that's the first example of the nirvana fallacy. Now, if you compare real-world alternatives, the current situation, with the realistic alternative, then leaving the UK would lead to a substantially smaller financial services industry in this country. Louis said there's a democratic deficit. You have already commented on this, but I mean, it's another of these, another typical nirvana fallacy. So many laws are being made without democratic control in this country. Well, what would be the realistic alternative? If the UK left, they needed some arrangement, like Norway has or Switzerland has, to gain access to the internal market, to the single market in the European Union. And the realistic alternative is that that the UK would not have any say in making up the rules for the single market anymore. Like Norway, for example, or even Switzerland, are so proud to be an old democracy, they have no say whatsoever in the rules of the single market, but still have to adopt them. So that's so far to the democratic deficit. Trade policy has also been mentioned. Trade policy, the proponents of leaving argue that leaving the UK will enable the UK government to make trade deals and increase exports to the emerging markets, to the fast-growing markets. In East Asia in particular. Well, if exporting to East Asia is such a big problem, why then is it that as a percentage of overall exports, Germany is exporting far more to East Asia than the UK does? Okay? It's not a problem of the European Union, it's a problem of competitiveness of this economy here. Even France and Italy are exporting more as a percentage of their total exports to the BRIC countries than the UK is. So it's not, it has nothing to do with the common trade policy, which is run in Brussels. It has to do with the lack of competitiveness of the UK manufacturing industry in particular. And my final point is trade policy deals, free trade deals, after leaving the European Union can be more easily made by the UK and will provide substantial benefits. Well, that is very unlikely to happen. Again, if you compare realistic alternatives, the UK will be a small and very weak negotiating partner for any other nation or group of nations, like East Asian nations or the United States, and will be in a very weak position to gain beneficial terms in free trade deals. The European Union is in a much stronger position to make preferable deals in terms of free trade agreements, and that's what's currently happening under the negotiations of the what's it called, the transatlantic investment and trade negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you, Horst. We will now open up the floor for a Q&A. You can ask questions by putting your hands up or tweeting using hashtag #GothDebates. And if you ask a question, Ben's going to take her name, as you'll be entitled to get a free pen from this week's sponsor, Allen and Overy. Yes, the gentleman there.
Yeah, so my question is to Louis, actually. Your argument basically was that you kind of associating the No campaign with emphasis on patriotism. Like, if we leave this country, we had the empire, we did this, we've got the monarchy, we've got a number of institutions. If we leave, we can do this on our own. I guess my question is, what kind of version of history are you reading at the moment? Because the world is not moving in that direction in any sense. You know, we've had a process of globalization where things are becoming more and more interconnected all the time. So this argument that you're kind of, if you're patriotic, you would say, knowing that this would take us back to an era where the UK was on its own and could do things by itself. I just find it difficult to appreciate it.
So you mentioned the empire, okay? I didn't actually mention the empire and reasons that I gave as to why I believe Britain has a strong negotiating position outside the EU. We are sold this myth that Britain isn't good enough, that we can't succeed outside the European Union. Think on the bigger picture. The world, there is a world beyond Europe, and as I mentioned in our speech, we're the world's fourth military power. Okay. Now that's not dependent on the monarchy. That's not really dependent on the empire nowadays. So that's one area in which we have influence on the global stage. We're a permanent seat holder on the UN Security Council, something that the European Union actually doesn't have. A couple of European countries do. That is, again, something that we have that the European Union doesn't possess. So that gives us actually more influence than Jean-Claude Juncker and Donald Tusk in that respect. The City of London, Bruce has mentioned it. Whether we're inside the European Union or not, we will still remain a world financial centre. Many of the reasons as to why we are a world financial centre today date back hundreds of years. They're not all dependent on our membership of the EEC. And what's ironic, actually, is something that Herbst brings up about banks saying they're going to leave the UK because we're not going to be part of the single market. But actually, when you read some of the articles as to why banks are saying they're going to leave the United Kingdom, the reasons they give are increased regulation. But actually, where does all this regulation come from? Brussels. So that's another way in which we're going to retain influence on the world stage by being a world financial centre. So they're just some of the reasons as to why Britain. Be optimistic. We're a lot better. We're a lot more influential than we seem to believe, and I think it's sad that we believe that nowadays. But hopefully, when we're out of the European Union, we'll realise that again. We are actually quite a respected and influential nation on the world stage.
Would the opposition like to respond to this?
Well, can I just briefly comment on one remark? You said that banks, if they leave at all, they're going to leave because of stricter regulations. Well, the stricter regulations of the financial system is coming anyway. It's being implemented all around the world, guided by the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, by global rules, and there's a global regulation committee actually chaired by Mike Carney, the governor of the Bank of England, and this stricter regulation to the most part is necessary to avoid another financial crisis. So that's not the key reason. The key reason why financial institutions will substantially reduce their presence in London if the UK decides to leave is because currently they're doing a lot of financial business in the EU, especially wholesale business, that is to say business between banks and with large corporations from out of London. Okay, and this is only possible within the European Union, within its regulatory framework, and with free access to all the financial markets in the European Union. If Britain left, there would be restrictions, and even tiny restrictions can have a very substantial impact on the profitability of international financial trades. And therefore, banks have clearly stated. I mentioned the example of Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank. The Swiss banks have been more muted, but they will also leave. Okay, so that's certain. If you want to cut a substantial number of high qualified jobs in the UK, namely in the financial services industry, especially for our graduates in economics, the UK should leave. And our graduates will leave as well. Welcome to Frankfurt.
Thank you. We'll move on now to have time for more questions. Yes, please.
I'll make a comment actually. Yeah. Actually, my first comment would be that EU wants to leave, UK wants to leave EU for selfish reason. Because you people believe that UK will be better off. But when you form an organization, you have to follow the principle of democratic centralism. If you want to make policies in favor of you, in favor of your belief or in favor of your arguments, you have to be inside and you have to convince other members to support your policy. So leaving the organization is not the way. You have to be inside and you have to fight, you have to convince others in favor of your arguments. That's the way. Secondly, when repeatedly you are saying that decisions are being made in the Brussels. Why do people say that? Because in the Brussels, this is the Parliament of European Union, where UK is a member as well. So if you say the decisions are made in Brussels, it conveys a wrong message. No, because in the decision-making body, in that Parliament, UK is a member as well. Thirdly, I would say that after the fall of Soviet Union, the world has been unipolar. So the existence of European Union would be a balance to the unipolar world. European Union can work as a very good balance for the unipolar world. So naturally, I won't go for the economic arguments. Finally, I would say that on the outset of the recent rise of Islamic terrorism in the world, European Union must work together. There is no alternative to that.
Okay. Would you like to respond to this comment?
Okay. So you mentioned at the start of your speech about to form relationships with other countries that we need to have some sort of democratic, centralised power of some sort. That we need to get people to follow our lead, and to do that we need to get them to buy into organisations that favour us, which they're not going to do. Is that kind of the thrust of what you were saying? Okay, all right. So, but what I'm saying so is by making trade agreements, trade is mutually beneficial. So it's not a matter of having someone buy into, your arguments when you say that we want to go and form trade agreements with other people. You want to go and do stuff with people that's mutually beneficial. So that's the first point. On the subject of terrorism, which was your last point, yes, we must show unity with our continental neighbours, at times like this. But I still don't see the argument, as civilised nation states that we are today, why we need to have a commission that has a sole right to propose legislation, why we need a parliament to which we only elect 10% of the members, and that's key. We say, you mentioned as well in the speech that we have representatives to the European Parliament. Yes, that is true, but they're in a very, very small minority. So again, I don't think your point about showing solidarity in the face of terrorism really is justification for the existence of an institution such as the European Union. Yes, we must show solidarity, but I don't think that means we have to be part of the EU.
Yes, please respond.
Well, yeah, I basically agree with what the gentleman over there said. That basically the idea that as you were saying before, we're trying to be sold this myth that the UK is not good enough. No, the thing is, the UK is good enough. You are a great country. It's just that you're better inside than outside. And in fact, you have a great sway in trying to influence policy, as you demonstrated before. Look at, for example, what happened in terms of European policy when Russia invaded Ukraine or annexed Crimea. The UK was at the forefront saying, let's impose sanctions on Russia.
Problem. They're not really an EU problem. The EU can come up with policies on tackling climate change, but regardless of that, it has to be done on an international level, because if the EU simply imposes its own policies to prevent climate change, it's simply going to make itself uncompetitive if other countries in the world don't follow suit. So these things like climate change are much better handled at an international level.
Would the opposition like to add anything?
Yeah, no? Okay. Well, okay, security policy, terrorism, etc. The only person really, the only major politician who would be really happy to see the UK leave the European Union would be Putin, because he has been trying to play off members of the European Union, member states, all the time, to drive a wedge between them. And only by being united, especially by imposing sanctions in a united way, has the European Union, has the West, been able to at least contain his expansionist policies. So again, if you look at realistic alternatives, the picture for out doesn't look that good, because the UK would have less influence on global politics, and it would also be in a much weaker position on the global stage. The American government, for example, has explicitly urged the UK to stay within the European Union for these reasons, because it is a stronger player on the global level, including at the United Nations, if it is a member of the European Union. Terrorism, fighting terrorism, of course, a very important issue currently. Again, we have a common security policy, justice policy, where the UK actually currently has an opt-out, but to some degree it should cooperate more, because terrorism is a global phenomenon, as we all know, and only by close cooperations of security agencies can this problem be solved properly. And the way to start is within the European Union. Of course, exchange of information with, let's say, America or other countries would help as well, but one thing does not exclude the other. Okay, so the best way to start here is within the European Union, to have a better coordinated policy to fight IS and other terrorist organizations.
We're seriously running out of time, so we'll take a couple more questions, but please make it short if possible. Yes, Joe?
Yeah, this is the proposition. No one's really mentioned today what would happen if Britain leaves the EU and then Scotland decides to leave the UK. And the fact that essentially leaving the EU could very well undermine all the things you've said that are good about Britain, because as a country it simply won't exist anymore. I don't know what your response to that is.
I mean, listen. I mean, that's a decision for the Scottish people. I mean, you know, I'm not here tonight to comment on my view on Scottish independence, but you know, at least they're free to have that debate. And what you said actually about, you know, if Scotland leave, then the United Kingdom would, you know, lose some of its sway, as that I mentioned, you know, on the international stage. Well, that's kind of part of the debate that, you know, people will make to be keeping Scotland in the United Kingdom, is that if you leave, then, you know, you yourselves will lose this sway on the international stage. But it's not really something that will Scotland vote to go independent if the UK leaves the EU? I think, you know, firstly, I think it'd be unwise for them to have a referendum. You know, if we vote to leave the EU on a Thursday, I think it'd be unwise for them to have the referendum on independence on the Friday, because I think they need time to see what the arrangements would be and how we could, you know, what our situation would be outside the EU. If it is a good one, which I believe it will be, then I'm sure they'll vote to stay. If it's not, then they'll be in their rights to vote to leave, but I don't think that'll be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I think probably, answering to your question, I think that unfortunately, as Louis might disagree with, I mean, if the UK did vote to leave the EU on Thursday, I'm pretty sure that Scotland would not choose to leave on Friday, would choose to leave on that very Thursday. Because as you have seen, I mean, after basically the vote of the Scottish referendum, Scottish nationalism has only gone up in Scotland. And as you can have seen, I mean, by the general election, I mean, look how many seats in the national parliament the SNP has. So I mean, Scotland leaving is not just, you know, some kind of or possibility. No, it's actually a very realistic threat. And losing bits and pieces after you've left one of the biggest trading bloc in the world, you're also losing pieces of your own country. I mean, how much credibility would you have in the international stage, realistically?
But one thing to remember though is that if Britain leaves the European Union, Scotland leaves the United Kingdom, Scotland then joins the back of the queue to join the European Union. And actually, as a new member state joining, which I believe that would be its status as a new member state applying for application, it would be obliged to join the Eurozone. So I don't think that's going to be something that's going to be too appealing to Scottish people in that eventuality.
We'll have to move on purely because of time constraints. Yes?
Yeah, this debate's been pretty Eurocentric so far, so I'd like to broaden it out to a global perspective. This is an open question for both teams. I'd like to know both teams' opinions on denying access to some of the world's poorest countries, to a market of 500 million you've already mentioned. There are billions of people around the world in very, very poor countries who are denied access to this market because of the tariff system that's enforced. And I'd just like to know your opinions whether it's economically and politically justifiable to do that, whether it's better to have the EU better off and create almost like a two-tier system around the globe.
Anyone from the position? Yes?
One of the EU's flagship policies, the Common Agricultural Policy. Okay, it's not only a policy that costs every taxpayer in this country £107 a year to subsidise inefficient farmers from across Europe, but it's actually one that imposes tariffs on many of those poor countries that you mentioned in the developing world because they can't sell their agricultural produce into Europe. They have to sell it at inflated and uncompetitive prices. We withdraw from that, we can extend our arm to those countries, and actually many of them are in the Commonwealth, something which I mentioned we have very close ties to. So we can help those countries by withdrawing from the European Union. You know, the EU tries to ease its conscience by giving away some foreign aid every year, but actually it's done nothing to help those countries in those very poor parts of the world, or very little. So that'd be my outlook on it.
I think your point is well taken. You're absolutely right. One of the worst aspects of EU policies is indeed the effect on developing countries by closing its borders or by raising high tariffs that exporters from these countries have to pay when exporting to the European Union. However, if Britain left, again, this you notice, right? Now the Nirvana fallacy still at work over there. No? Britain would impose a free trade policy and abolish all the tariffs that it currently has to levy because of the common trade policy. Well, there are protectionists in these countries as well, including the farm lobby in particular. So to assume that once the UK has left, all the restrictive regulations, including tariffs and other regulations, will be abolished is simply completely unrealistic. And also, if the UK leaves, and the UK is much more pro-market than other member states like France, for example, the rest of the European Union would become much more protectionist because one advocate of free market policies, namely the UK, one big advocate, has left. So the French would get their way and make the European Union even more protectionist. And on balance, that would harm developing countries even more. They would be harmed more. The UK within the European Union is a force for good, so to speak, especially when it comes to trade policy. Of course, it's not an ideal world. There is no such thing as an ideal world, but it's better than the alternative.
We've got another question from Twitter. Louis Jones is asking the opposition, what reforms of the EU would be necessary for continued UK membership?
What reforms of the EU would be necessary for continued UK membership? Well, I mean, really that question should be asked to them because, I mean, I think that basically my belief is that what Cameron is trying to bring to the table, I mean, is not really the solution to some basic problems that not only the UK faces in the EU, but it's also more generally problems that the EU faces. It's not really being addressed. I mean, they're more sort of face-saving, solutions that don't address, basic problems such as, a more shift towards a very market-oriented policy and, trying to leave aside the more social policies. So I think that to convince, in a way, the UK to stay in the EU, probably you would have to, probably the EU would have to agree to anyhow Cameron's policies, and probably try to say, well, down the line, if you stay, probably we'll try and guarantee you some other things. I mean, I'm not an expert on this, but probably it will be more with some caveats that we know will probably be, behind closed doors more than anything else.
Well, I think one thing that does have to be published is actually what Mr. Cameron has to ask is the EU to actually publish what its plans are for the long term. It's all very well using short-term QE, but what happens when QE runs out? It'd be very interesting to know what the plan Z is. We must be up to plan Z by now for solving this problem. The other thing is, and if I can perhaps come back to an earlier point about the city, the fact is that the UK is subject to European regulatory strictures which do harm the city and make it less competitive. The one which I know has been in the news is the fact that in the UK, in the city, the payment of bonuses has now been highly regulated, and it has meant that there are main competitor centres are able to have a liberal policy on bonuses, pay whatever the market decides, and this has had an adverse effect on the city. Although, of course, the bonus payments is not a popular thing, it is a part of the competitive structure in the financial world. And the other thing I would very quickly say is that regarding the city, what David Cameron needs to know is just how many more regulations are going to be imposed on it. We've heard of the financial transactions tax. It's not been imposed yet, but it has been widely discussed. So he does need to find out exactly what areas the UK will be able to control itself and what the Eurozone will be able to control.
Horst, would you like to?
Yeah, I think that the question was excellent. What reforms are necessary? And actually, the point I would like to make is that any reforms that Britain wants, that the British government wants, can be attained more easily within the European Union than outside. Take immigration. One key concern the UK government has and the UK people have concerning immigration from other EU countries is that these immigrants come here to draw benefits. We've heard before from Edwin that this is actually not true on balance. That the Poles come here to work and they draw little benefits and contribute a lot to the public purse, paying their taxes. But the European Court of Justice actually in several recent decisions has ruled that limiting the payment of welfare benefits to immigrants, at least for an initial period, would be in line with EU law. So this goal that the UK government has of reducing welfare tourism can be attained within the European Union. Other goals that the UK government has, namely completing the single market, especially in the area of services, can also be more easily attained, of course, within the European Union. Outside the UK being outside the European Union, this has no impact at all on what the European Union does decide on the single market. But within the European Union, the UK has allies, okay, that are in favor of completing the single market. Most importantly, the current Commission has already started initiatives in this direction, and also member countries like the Netherlands, Germany, and Eastern European countries are broadly in favor of completing the single market. So this reform also can be achieved. It will be hard work, it will take some time, there's no perfect solution, but it can be more easily attained by Britain staying within the European Union. So reforms can be achieved.
Thank you, Horst. Now I'm sure you have many more questions and you have many more comments, but we're already running over time.